All right, so we are here with Tania Vrga from Crossfit Winnipeg, and we're going to be talking about steel clubs and maces. And pretty much we're going to get a sense of like, what are these tools? How do we use them? And I guess one of the things is we want to ask you, like, how did you find steel clubs and maces, and how do you use them in your training?
Well, that's such a good question, because it's going to open up a cool can of worms, which is that I think this is the case for a lot of people, that CrossFit is kind of like a gateway drug to all of these different training modalities that you may not touch otherwise. So when I was in my late teens and early 20s, mostly I was just kind of running and doing yoga and, you know, doing your standard kind of bodybuilding style upper lower body splits kind of thing. And when I discovered CrossFit, I was like, oh wow, there's this whole other world of barbells and kettlebells and bodyweight training and handstands and all of this cool fun stuff. And so I transitioned from CrossFit to kettlebells, and I was certified as a kettlebell instructor through Agatsu and through, at that point, RKC. And then that is what eventually got me into the maces and the clubs, through some of my mentors with Agatsu. So that's how I started it. I tend to use these tools a whole lot for, I guess what you would call flow-based training, which is a really good way to warm up, and it's also a really good way to just kind of like do a little finisher at the end of a workout, where you're just kind of moving and moving in different planes of movement that you would not otherwise move in.
So how, like, what was your first impression, like, when you grabbed one of these clubs or maces? What was your first, like, what was the first thought you had in your head?
There's a lot of fear around tools like this, because there's always this thing that, like, oh, I don't know how to do this, I'm gonna feel silly, I'm not coordinated. There's always kind of that fear when you pick up a tool that you never picked up before, and that's especially so when it comes to tools like this, because they're not it's not like your everyday tool, and if you don't know how to use it, you might just pick it up and go, oh, you know, what do I do with this thing? So my first thought was like being afraid of looking silly, actually. But I had a really, really good teacher. I had some really good teachers who were just amazing and just really, really patient. And once you get an aha moment, it's amazing. You just feel like you're in it, and you just keep going, and your body feels so good. So that's kind of something to aspire to with tools like this.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that brought me here, was you training me, right? So I mean, if I wouldn't have had like numerous aha moments when we did our Agatsu certification for kettlebells, I remember when you had a wooden club, and you're like, what is this? And then you're showing some windmills, and you're like, this is great for athletes who throw. And then all of a sudden you caught my attention, because I'm always looking for ways that people can become stronger or prevent injuries. And then it stuck with me for a while, and then here we are, you know. So yeah, that was my first impression with the club. Is I never even touched it. I heard the explanation, I saw it happen, and I was like, yeah, this is going to be great. So yeah, no, I'm very happy that it's brought us here.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of there's crossover, right, from a lot of people who do kettlebells. Because of, I guess, the weight distribution of the kettlebell, there's a lot of things that you might do with a kettlebell that you might do with a heavy club. There's some stuff that you can only do with a kettlebell, and there's also some stuff that you can only do with a mace.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a lot of crossover there, and so if there are, you know, people out there who are really into like kettlebell flow training, I think working with clubs or mace would be like the next logical step for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Like, and that's kind of what sparked my interest. Was we were obviously training with kettlebells, and you saw this, and like, this looks really cool. So we have some more questions here. So, in terms of a steel club mace, what are these tools exactly?
Okay, so let's start with let's start with the mace.
Mhm.
So this thing,
Yeah.
right here. So, obviously this is kind of built upon, an old school like weapon, right? I guess you smash stuff with. This is, I don't actually know that much about the history of it. It feels very similar to, let's say, a sledgehammer. So if you've ever done like sledgehammer training, let's say like hitting a tire with a sledgehammer or something like that. So you could use a mace for something similar to that. So basically you've got your long handle and you've got your weight at the end of it. So there's maces like these. You can also get ones that have a bigger end that you can fill with like water or sand, which kind of changes the weight distribution a little bit more.
Nice.
They're really fun. But something like this would be something that I would probably recommend for someone who's starting out with a mace. And typically the two kind of main exercises that you'll do with the mace are going to be something called a 360 and something called 10 and 2,
Okay.
2 and 10. Some people just call them pulls. But if you were to do, let's say, a mace competition, those would be kind of the main movements that you would see. So this would be very much like a cyclical endurance-based thing, really similar to what you would see, let's say, in a kettlebell competition, if you were to do, like a snatch test, something like that.
Okay.
So you're breathing throughout the whole thing, and the idea with this movement is that you can train planes of motion that you wouldn't usually train. So for all those CrossFitters out there, bodybuilders out there who are kind of always kind of working in this kind of, you're moving forward and you're moving back. If you've got a good trainer, maybe your trainer is having you move from side to side a little bit, but that's generally where it stops for most people, right? So now this tool creates a situation where you can add in some rotational movement. You can move not only in this plane, but in this plane, and then also the
Transverse plane.
Yeah, transverse plane as well. Yeah.
Awesome. So if I'm going to take a look at these, what are the similarities between the two tools? You see like there's weight distribution at the far end. So the club has all the weight at the end of the handle. The mace has the same thing. So what are the similarities between the two of them?
The similarities are that the weight is distributed more towards the end of the tool, so that now creates also an opportunity for not only like cyclical rotational movements, but also it creates the opportunity for kind of something that's a little bit more dynamic and flow-based, a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for, ballistic?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure.
And so the main difference is the mace is generally longer, and you're usually holding it at the end. The club is going to be a little bit shorter. The weight is still distributed at the end. I find that if I have a mace, I'm generally just working with one mace. If I have clubs, I might do some flows or some exercise with two clubs. So it kind of allows you to have like symmetrical or asymmetrical movement patterns, right? So the movements that you're going to do with both are going to be, there might be some similarities, but the moves themselves are going to be different.
Okay. So what should I consider before I even pick up one of these things, like in terms of my own mobility and movement? Because obviously if we're going to be starting to move through the transverse plane, going through overhead as well as rotation, developing torque, there's probably some mobility considerations that I need to take in mind before I start. So what do you think?
So generally, we have kind of like a little bit of, I guess a little tester or an assessment that we do. Particularly for the mace, because of the positions that you're going to be in. So I'm carrying the club right now. We do something similar, let's say with a kettlebell or with a mace, but this position here, whether I'm carrying a mace or a club, if I have restricted thoracic mobility, if I've got tightness in the lats, those kinds of things, tightness in the shoulders, and I just kind of pick up a mace that's too heavy, and let's say if my technique is not great, that's where I could kind of end up in a situation where maybe I might aggravate my shoulders, I might aggravate my elbows, So some of the tests that we'll do is just testing thoracic mobility and testing lat length before we start really swinging, doing like high volume swings on a mace, or even high volume stuff with this. Another thing that we will tend to check is whether a client, when we start working with any of these tools, same as like with a kettlebell, is to make sure that the client has an understanding of basically spinal mechanics. So do we know how to hinge over and pick something up in a safe manner, right? So it's a little bit like when we teach kettlebells, you know, like part of the whole, even any kind of lesson that you do on a kettlebell is going to be how do you pick it up and how do you put it back down. And so those are the main considerations is body awareness, shoulder mobility, thoracic mobility, and awareness when it comes to spinal mechanics.
Awesome. Okay, so a lot of people have been asking us, well, which one is better?
Oh, good question.
Yeah,
You're asking me the really hard questions.
Yeah, which one is better?
Personally, I like the combo of a heavy mace, one heavy mace, and two smaller, lighter clubs. That's the combination that I like, because I will use them for two different things. So light clubs I will use for shoulder warm-up and mobility. So amazing having the weight distributed at the end. What that does is it actually, when you start kind of swinging them around, it starts to create a joint distraction. So it starts to kind of create some space in the joint as you're moving it around. So really great for kind of all the fluid in the joint, but also it just, if you've got a history of like impingement and that kind of thing, it's amazing. You can take a 20-minute shoulder warm-up and cram it into 3 minutes. If you have a couple of light clubs like this and you know some techniques for spinning it around. If I wanted to do some heavier training and I wanted to replace, let's say, a barbell, or I wanted something really versatile where I could actually build a little bit of muscle mass and a little bit of hypertrophy, then I'd go with a heavier club.
Yeah, for sure. So then, if you want to start using clubs and maces, what weight should we start off with? Like, what should we consider? I guess you should consider with any training tools, like, what are my training goals, right? So like, well, people say, well, how heavy clubs should I get? I think we should probably go back to your thing of considering mobility and what access to range of motion you have and any sort of restrictions. But I mean, just generally speaking, what sort of clubs would you suggest someone start off with? Like light 5-pound clubs, maybe a 4 kg mace?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good place, especially for a female or someone who is maybe a little bit lighter in body weight, because body weight's going to have an impact on that too, right? So for the ladies out there, or you know, people who are, let's say, under a couple hundred pounds or whatever, a 4 or 5 kilogram mace, like a 10 to 12 pound kind of deal on the mace, is a really good place to start, assuming that we can hit those positions and that we're good to go as far as thoracic mobility and shoulder mobility. For clubs, if you're getting just clubs and not a mace, and you want to use it for more, like you said, goals of general fitness and strength and hypertrophy, then maybe go with something a little bit heavier, like something closer to the weight of the mace, maybe a little lighter, 5 to 10 pounds on the club. Or if you're using it as a warm-up tool for shoulders, then I would go really light, like 1 or 2 kilograms, and get 2 of these. Yeah.
I mean, just to give you an idea, I mean, what Tania has in her hand right now is a 6 kg steel club. The mace we have here is 4 kg, but the difference in weight, like this feels like it's like a feather, and this one here feels like it's like a rock. I guess the smaller size too, right? So when you're thinking about clubs, the weight doesn't always mean the weight. I mean, how much area is that weight distributed over is something to consider too, right? Where it's like small area. So now, in terms of athletes, I mean, I see that there's maybe a lot of benefits for athletes. I mean, even people that have to do like emergency rescue workers carrying people over their shoulders. I mean, what kind of professions and athletes might benefit from steel club and mace training?
I think any professions or sport where you are carrying something that is in any way awkward, which is pretty much much every job.
Yeah.
So as far as sports, throwing sports, golf, be really, really good tools for those kinds of sports. But also like OCR, like obstacle course stuff. This would be a really great tool for that because you're moving on all those different planes of movement. As far as jobs, yeah, all the first responder jobs where you're carrying people, carrying things, pulling things. I kind of like envision like a lumberjack or something like that, like, you know, that would be really, you know, would be a really useful tool for something like that. But the other place that I think a lot of people don't think about is, let's say you are, you're playing even just a sport, like a team sport, like hockey or lacrosse, where there are a lot of, you're handling a stick and you're not necessarily just moving forward and back, you're moving in all kinds of different directions. That would be very useful. And then the last place I would say is CrossFitters, and bodybuilders, in the sense that I find that that's a hole in a lot of CrossFitters and bodybuilders training, is they're not training in all those different planes of movement. And then when they are in a real life situation where they have to move in that way, their body's not prepared. So this would be a great addition to just your typical gym rat routine.
So what about grip strength? How can these steel clubs and steel maces be used to improve grip strength?
Just by virtue of having to carry them for the amount of time that you're going to be carrying them during a typical workout, very useful. And we know, like, there's a lot of science to back up this idea that grip strength is correlated with a whole bunch of other aspects of like health and fitness and longevity. And it's similar to like kettlebells, you know. Kettlebells are really great for grip strength as well. The interesting thing is that a tool like this, once you gain the capacity to train for a longer period of time and you actually learn the technique, and you start, let's say, doing sets of 5-10 minutes of a particular flow, or 360s with the mace, your goal becomes not just to train the grip, but to only use as much energy as you need to use to get the job done, so that you can then focus your energy on the right things. So as much as you are training your grip, one of the things that we like to mention to people when they're starting out is, like, don't over grip. You're gonna like waste your energy on that, right? So it's like it's a Goldilocks thing. Not too little, not too much.
Exactly. So what is something that I can do with a steel club that I can't do with a steel mace?
Things that you can do with a steel club that you can't do with a steel mace. Any kind of passing or juggling, I feel like, would be very, very difficult to do with the mace, just because the handle is too long. So any kind of like throwing or anything where the edge of the club, so for example, if I did a mill, which is kind of like going back here with the club and then internally rotating and then going behind, if I had a handle that was too long, I would not be able to do that. So those kinds of movements. Also any I was going to say any two-handed movements, but you could figure out a way, for example, to do, if you wanted to train grip strength with the mace, you could work on like an uneven carry on one side and the other side. So you could carry two maces if you're doing like a farmer's carry or something like that. But that's something where I would choose a club, because it's just a little less unwieldy. Exactly. But anything where I'm kind of like really swinging it around in really big arches, that's where I would choose. That's where I would choose the heavy mace.
So one thing when we're looking at anything about steel clubs and maces, there's this idea about torque. You can create torque, right? And you hear this like torque, and you hear it a lot in training. So I guess just to explain, what is torque, and how can using steel clubs and maces improve a person's ability to generate or resist torque?
Wow, that's such a good question. So torque is this idea of rotational force. So leveraging rotation. So we often think about it when we think about, like, if you're into like mechanics or whatever, like a motor, right?
Yeah.
A motor that has a lot of torque, meaning there's a lot of energy bound up in this like spiraling movement that's happening. So this actually comes back to this whole discussion of training in different planes of movement. So like you said not just working with torque, but also resisting torque.
Right.
This is something that a lot of trainers don't talk about, is this idea of anti-rotational movement and rotational movement. So it's a big hole in people's training. So there's a few key areas where these tools can really be helpful. Number one is just exposing people to those movements, because a lot of people have just never ever done anything except move forward and back. So you have to start somewhere. You have to expose people to some kind of movement at that point. The other thing that you can do is, because you can change the weight distribution, and you can also change your grip. So if I'm working with a mace, if I choke up on it, it'll feel lighter. And if I bring my grip more towards the end, it'll feel heavier. So if I'm wanting to teach someone about rotational mechanics and torque mechanics, this is a great way to build some awareness by saying, okay, we're going to try, let's say maybe I stand up and I do a squat, and I'm holding my mace, and I can maybe squat down to the bottom of my squat, press it out, and try to do a rotation. I can kind of teach that person about, okay, it's going to feel easier when the weight is closer to you, and it's going to feel easier when you're more choked up on it, versus it's going to feel harder. Now the other thing that I can do is I can start changing the direction. So I can say, okay, well now I'm going to squat with my mace, and I'm going to have the heavy part of my mace on one side, and my job is to squat but not let my whole body get carried over by the heavy side of that mace. So that is like basically your most basic form of anti-rotational training, is having more weight on one side than the other, and learning to resist the temptation to just let yourself be pulled over.
Awesome. So what are, if I was going to say, like, foundational movements, I mean, I kind of go away from that, like, I guess foundational exercises. What are the foundational exercises if someone was going to say, like, okay, I'm going to get myself 2 kg clubs, what do I do now? Like, what exercises do I work on to kind of build a base? And I guess in terms of, like, well, what are you going to do? Are you doing heavy pullovers? Are you doing windmills? I guess that's things you got to consider. So where does a person start once you got the tools?
Once you've got the tools, well, I think there's 2 ways to approach this. The first approach is that a foundational movement, regardless of the implement, is still a foundational movement. So, like, you know, if you have a trainer, or regardless of who you are, you're probably going to want to include some kind of squat, some kind of hinge, some kind of push, some kind of pull,
and
right?
Carry, right? Yeah.
And some kind of carry, right? And so you can definitely just start playing around with the tools while you are doing movements that you already know. And then you can start working on those leverages and those anti-rotational movements, try to see if you can offset the weight a little bit to challenge yourself a little more. So that's strategy number 1. Strategy number 2 is just get really, really good at the basics of the movements that are specific to the clubs. That's probably what more you're asking, I'm thinking. So for example, with the clubs, the main kind of movements that we see are casts, cleans, pulls, what am I missing? Mills. So those are all those kind of weird rotational movements that you may not do if you didn't have this tool, because they're very, very specific to these tools. With the mace, it would probably be your like top 3 would be to learn 360s, 10 and 2s, and then the rest is kind of more leverage lifts and kind of side to side, kind of grip switching and stuff like that. So on this, on the mace, that's what I would suggest as your top 3 would be your 360s, your 10 and 2s, and then I put all the other leverage lifts and carries in a category on its own, because you don't necessarily need to learn the technique. Like if you already know how to do a carry, now you're just gonna learn how to do it with the mace. If you already know how to squat, now you're just gonna make it harder by putting all the weight on one side.
Interesting.
And then you can kind of create flows. That's where it gets really fun, where you pick, let's say you get really, really good at the basics first, get really good at your 3 basics plus all your primal movements, and then you start picking, let's say 2 or 3 and putting them together into like a little flow.
Interesting.
So that's kind of how I would do it, is with the mace I would learn those 3 basics. With these it would be mills, casts, cleans, those kinds of things. Get really good at those basics, and then start putting them together with all of your basic primal movements like squats and hinges and pushes and pulls.
Interesting. What do you think about swinging steel clubs?
It's a great idea. Great idea. You can start, you can do 2 hands or just 1 hand, and if you only do 1 hand, you're still being pulled off to one side a little bit more, so you're getting that anti-rotational training that you can't get any other place. You can start switching hands. You can do off to the side, suitcase style, or you can do in between the legs, or you can switch to the other side. You can do different planes of movement. You can swing it in front of you or behind you. So yeah, definitely, like, I think that all that stuff, that we learn with kettlebells, you can do with this stuff. So, you would do a halo with a kettlebell. Halos with clubs are awesome.
Seems a little bit easier with a club, actually.
Yeah, a little bit less awkward.
So the last question is, if someone is having some like apprehension about using clubs and maces, I guess it depends on like what the essence of that apprehension is. But what could you recommend to someone that's a little bit like, well, I'm kind of not sure if I should try this? Well, what would you say to that?
Well, like everything else in life, you're not the first person to ask this question.
Yeah.
So find someone who's already answered this question
exactly,
and get them to help you. Yeah. That's what you did, which is awesome.
Yeah.
So, it's rare that we're the only ones who are experiencing some apprehension when it comes to this, right? And so I would say, seek out some help. Just like, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to need someone to help, but when it comes to learning the basics, if you can just learn the basics really, really well, find someone who can teach you those basics. And there's lots of good online stuff, but we have such great resources in the city here too. Like, there's amazing people. So, find some help so that you can at least learn the basics, and then you can like be like a badass in your basement and
That's right.
or your garage and.
Yeah, and that's the good thing about these, that you can really take them anywhere, right?
Yeah.
You train anywhere, so that's good.
Yeah. I don't know what they would say if I brought this to the airport, though.
You know what? I wouldn't mind trying. It's like free promo.